Jalen Pierce had built his reputation quietly. A senior software engineer at Axiom Labs, a high-growth tech company whose suite of cloud infrastructure tools powered mid-sized financial firms, he was the kind of coder who saw patterns other engineers missed. His mother used to tell him he had a scanner brain, the ability to notice when one pixel was out of place in a vast picture. He'd taught himself secure coding practices by dissecting public breach postmortems in the evenings, driven not by ego, but by the desire to build systems that didn't fail the people who trusted them. It was during a routine code audit of the company's flagship identity management microservice that Jalen saw it. A subtle race condition in the session token validation logic. Under heavy concurrent requests, an edge case in normal testing but realistic under real-world load, the system could, for a few milliseconds, accept a malformed token that bypassed multi-factor validation if a precise timing combination occurred. The dependency chain involved a cached nonce, an asynchronous callback, and a legacy compatibility shim that had been bolted on after a major integration 6 months prior. The result was not a full compromise in ordinary circumstances, but in the hands of an attacker who could orchestrate the sequence, it would allow session hijacking, privilege escalation, and lateral movement inside customer environments, all without leaving obvious logs. Jalen built a reproducible exploit in his isolated sandbox, documenting the exact timing windows, the code path, and a proposed patch, reordering the validation to make nonce consumption atomic, eliminating the shim in favor of an idempotent adapter, and adding a lightweight timing fuzz layer to break deterministic abuse. He prepared a clear technical write-up, including risk impact scenarios, how a stealth exploit could look like normal behavior until exfiltration, and submitted it to the internal vulnerability reporting system, tagging the security team and copying his immediate manager, Elena. The company was in the middle of preparing for their quarterly investor demo. The CEO, Martin Caldwell, a charismatic white founder who had risen from startup wonderkind to media darling, had been publicly pushing Axiom Labs as bulletproof infrastructure in interviews. Security had become a brand pillar. Martin regularly held innovation fireside chats, where engineers could present ideas. But in practice, his calendar was tight, and anything that seemed like a theoretical problem got deprioritized unless it had been packaged with visible metrics or came from the inner circle of his advisory tech stars. When Jalen's report bubbled up, his manager forwarded a summarized version to the security operations lead. The ops team, stretched thin, scheduled the issue for a low-priority review next sprint. Jalen, unsatisfied with the delay given the potential damage, scheduled 5 minutes in the open feedback portion of Martin's monthly all-hands. He prepared a demo, a controlled reproduction showing a simulated identity hijack on a staging instance, the exploit's stealth characteristics, and the patch's simplicity. Standing in the vivid auditorium, a room lined with sleek monitors, startup-branded beanbags, and TV screens playing the company's growth metrics, Jalen stepped up to the mic. Martin, charismatic and in the middle of answering questions about global expansion, nodded politely when introduced. Jalen laid out the findings succinctly. There's a timing edge in the session validation path that, when orchestrated by a determined actor under concurrency, could bypass MFA and escalate privileges. I've built a proof of concept. The patch is minimal and non-disruptive. Martin smiled, the kind of practiced smile that signaled interest, but not necessarily action. Thanks, Jalen. Our systems have been through penetration tests. This sounds very edge-casey. Our security advisor team is already on top of things. Let's log it, and if it shows up in the wild, we'll circle back. He turned, redirected the conversation, and moved into the next talking point about user adoption metrics. The room applauded the quarterly growth statistics. Jalen was left in the glow of the projection screen, with a polite nod from the CEO and a quiet shrug from the security team lead. Later, Elena pulled him aside. Don't take it personally, she said. Martin's got a lot on his plate. We'll get to it. Submit a more formal ticket if you can. Maybe get a second pair of eyes to sign off. Jalen nodded, but the apprehension didn't ease. The model of the exploit continued to haunt him in his sleep. Not because he wanted recognition, but because he knew how quickly a small leak became a flood in software systems once exploited. Unable to get immediate traction through official channels, Jalen began covertly strengthening his case while continuing his regular workload. He knew that pushing too hard publicly risked being labeled alarmist, especially in an environment where the CEO's earlier offhand comments about engineers who dwell on hypotheticals had circulated in internal forums. Jalen reached out to Maya Chen, a member of the internal red team and someone who had a history of advocating for proactive patching even if it wasn't seen externally. He shared the exploit under a non-disclosure understanding, and Maya ran her own independent tests, confirming the fragility of the non's consumption logic. She also helped him refine the demonstration so it could be held up in a way that separated theoretical edge case from practical exploitation vector. Together, they built a small internal tool that could simulate attacker-controlled concurrency across the affected endpoint, using controlled requests to demonstrate the silent hijack and the potential for lateral movement. They also designed a lightweight monitoring guard, a temporary patch that would detect anomalies in timing variance and flag any session creation sequences that matched the exploit's fingerprint without yet deploying the full fix, framing it as early detection telemetry to buy time. Jalen packaged everything, this time with logging evidence from the tool and an internal risk model estimating customer exposure. A dozen sensitive clients used the affected pathway for admin session handoff during batch processes, making them likely early targets. He elevated the issue again, now with a cross-validated tag from the internal red team member, and copied the lead of the Rapid Response Security Council, a rotating cross-functional group created after a small breach the prior year had narrowly missed escalation. Still, the response was sluggish. The Security Council, concerned about triggering a company-wide panic ahead of the Investor Day, leaned toward monitoring the telemetry. Martin's chief of staff forwarded a note to Elena. Can we shelf the high-risk sounding items until after the demo? We can't have potential instability being discussed externally. Elena, under implicit pressure to keep the message stream smooth, told Jalen to reframe the communication as incremental improvement, not alarm, and to let the guard telemetry run while the broader fix waited for the next development cycle. Jalen was frustrated. The exploit sat like a sleeping animal in their infrastructure. He had a moral calculus: deploy the full patch internally on staging without announcement and document the deviation from expected release policies, or wait and risk a real attacker discovering and weaponizing it. He chose a third path. He wrote the patch in a way that it could be toggled and quietly piloted the patch within a small internal sandbox used by the security team themselves, presenting the results as a performance optimization, a framing less threatening to the higher-ups while exposing the need for the underlying structural change. The patch, once activated, eliminated the timing window and simplified the validation logic. The overhead was negligible. He also prepared secretly a failure scenario runbook. If the vulnerability was ever actively probed in production, there were detection, containment, and communication steps identified, complete with stakeholders to call, to minimize damage and identify attribution. Unbeknownst to Jalen, a group of independent cybercriminals had been circling Axiom Labs for months. They were not a disorganized script kiddie crew, but a small syndicate specializing in high-value identity breaches. Black market access to session tokens could be sold to competitors, or used to drain trust accounts indirectly through compromised partner interfaces. They had been probing peripheral services, performing subtle timing analysis on various endpoints, and triangulating weak spots in legacy integrations. The reconnaissance team's machine learning pipeline flagged the identity management microservice as a ripe target due to inconsistent latency patterns under load tests. The syndicate's lead, a pseudonymous figure known as Obsidian, had a sense for systemic rhythm. When their advanced tooling detected the slight drift in token validation under certain concurrency combinations, they suspected it wasn't a random bug, but an exploitable weakness, one that could be wielded without setting off typical intrusion detection thresholds. Obsidian tasked a collaborator to construct a fingerprint of the anomaly, subtly adjusting request pacing to map the timing window, and building an automated spray that could, with enough coverage, catch a valid hijack without triggering rate-limiting heuristics. As the hacker operation matured, they prepared their approach, gain access to a low-privileged client API key, execute parallel session creation attempts with injected malformed tokens, capture valid escalated sessions, and then pivot into internal admin consoles. Their internal simulations suggested that a successful attack would appear as routine admin activity, untouched by the usual pattern-based alarms. Jalen's earlier telemetry guard, quietly active in the sandbox, began to flicker anomalies, micro-variances in session timing that previously had gone unflagged. Maya, who had been reviewing the nightly telemetry digest, noticed the deviation, an uptick in almost exploit attempts that matched the fingerprint they had defined. She alerted Jalen directly with a terse message. "We're seeing the preamble. Someone's poking the sequence. Logs attached. Activate contingency." Jalen went cold. This was no longer hypothetical. He immediately triggered the contingency runbook. He elevated the active anomaly into a priority incident with the Security Operations Center under a neutral label, Performance Latency Investigation, to avoid tipping external eyes that a vulnerability was known. He also pushed the full patch through the internal toggle for a broader deployment, invoking the emergency rollback clause in the staging environment policy. The patch landed silently on internal diagnostic instances. The exploit preamble immediately began to fail, and the timing variance metric normalized. Yet Obsidian had more than one vector. The syndicate, aware of partial closures in their own simulated attacks, adjusted. They attempted to pivot, targeting a high-value customer admin session during the quarterly investor release, when noise would camouflage subtle movements. They assembled the automated injector, wrapped in obfuscation layers, and time-synced their attack to coincide with peak traffic, hoping the race window would open and give them their foothold. The scheduled attack unfolded like clockwork. Obsidian's automated system sent thousands of concurrent crafted session creation attempts aimed at the targeted customer environment. In previous weeks, the timing window had produced clean escalations. This time, the authentication pipeline consumed nonces atomically, and the timing fuzz scrambled deterministic ordering. A few attempts scraped the edge, but the patch diffused them. Behind the scenes, the Security Operations Center was suddenly awash in alerts. The telemetry system, which had been tuned to flag the almost exploit signature, now picked up a coordinated burst that had the hallmarks of an external probing campaign. The internal performance latency investigation ticket exploded in priority, and a war room was stood up. Jalen and Maya were pulled in, their earlier attempts to silence the issue forgotten in the adrenaline rush. The syndicate, seeing their attempts fail, tried to adapt, switching to the fallback plan of escalating through a lateral identity pivot. Elsewhere in the environment, they tried to exploit a stale token replay, using a secondary shim that had been overlooked. Jalen had anticipated the fallback. He had instrumented additional guards on deprecated authentication paths months earlier, an act framed as deprecation cleanup in internal documentation so it wouldn't raise bureaucratic eyebrows. Those fallback attempts tripped internal counters, and the combined influence of patch effectiveness and defensive depth caused the attack to shatter into fragmented noise. Security analysts moved quickly to lock down any suspicious sessions, and the internal incident response team traced the fingerprints back to a cluster of compromised external IPs. The attempted breach, had it succeeded, would have opened administrative windows into multiple high-value client environments. Digital access that could have been monetized or used to disrupt partner services in ways the PR team would have struggled to contain. Instead, the postmortem would later show no customer data exfiltration, no lateral compromise, and only a brief, contained anomaly signature. The investor demo went on without a hitch. In the war room, the mood was tense but controlled. Martin, alerted by his security chief about a potential major probing incident that was deflected, showed up in person looking for answers. Jalen, called into the smaller briefing, outlined what had happened without sensationalizing. He presented the timeline, the reconnaissance, the partial probe, the attempted escalation, and the decisive effect of the patch. Maya supplemented with the telemetry graphs, showing the burst of activity and how the system's layered defenses degraded the attack into harmless artifacts. Martin, whose brand had been built on resilience, instinctively reached for the narrative. Great teamwork. But the picture wasn't complete. He asked pointed questions about the lead time, why the council hadn't been briefed earlier, and whether the near miss had been avoidable. Jalen carefully explained the communication friction, the earlier deprioritization, and the quiet rollout of the patch. Martin's smile froze in that moment. The edge case language from before rang hollow in the face of what had almost been a catastrophic breach. He made a note, publicly framed later as kudos to detection, but privately began to reassess his earlier dismissal. In the days that followed, the incident response team conducted a deep dive. The official internal summary labeled it a coordinated external probing attempt mitigated through agile defense. But Jalen knew that sanitized framing would not change the systemic near failure behind it. He pushed for a full root cause analysis, insisting that the original vulnerability, the race condition, and the decision flow that had delayed its remediation be included in leadership briefings. Martin scheduled a closed-door security review meeting. The room was tight, filled with executives, security leadership, legal counsel, and a subdued Martin at the head. Jalen and Maya were asked to present their findings. Elena, who once told Jalen to reframe the message, sat to the side, watching. Jalen started with the technical deconstruction, but didn't stop there. He laid out the human factors, how the cultural bias toward growth PR over quiet vigilance had delayed an urgent remediation, how framing technical debt as theoretical let real-world adversaries exploit assumptions, and how the company's incentive structure, in which publicized uptime stats trumped internal security risk narratives, created a soft barrier to early action. Martin, whose instinct was to deflect, found himself in uncharted territory. The security chief, someone who had quietly supported the detection infrastructure but hadn't been in the direct line of earlier dismissals, spoke plainly. We could have been in the headlines for a breach. That would have taken down customer trust, delayed our IPO talk, and given attackers foothold we'd be chasing for months. This wasn't luck. It was Jalen and Maya pushing through internal inertia. There was silence. The room's dynamics shifted. Martin, after a long pause, addressed the systemic issue bluntly. We need a new process. I dismissed this when it mattered. That was wrong. I want to make sure the next vulnerability like this doesn't sit in limbo. He asked for recommendations. Jalen proposed a formal security escalation board with dedicated triage for classes of risk that bypassed marketing calendars, a fast-track patch protocol for critical edge findings, and an inclusion of proactive internal risk champions in product roadmaps. Maya added a suggestion for a small red team stipend to validate high-impact patches without the fear of being labeled alarmists. The pull toward public recognition came from two directions. The legal team, eager to craft a PR narrative that would soothe potential customer worry, drafted a release praising our world-class internal detection and quick mitigation. Martin caught the draft and, in a moment of rare humility, insisted they include a sidebar crediting the engineers. Name them, he said, not just the team. Name Jalen and Maya. People need to see that the ones who do the hard work don't get lost behind the brand. At the same meeting, in a shorter aside, Martin pulled Jalen into a small room. I was wrong, he said. You were right to flag it. I didn't give it the weight it deserved. I want to clean that up, in how we communicate and in how we structure this going forward. Help me figure out what that looks like. Jalen, cautious, agreed to participate in shaping the new protocols, but didn't let the reconciliation paper over deeper change needs. He insisted on a written commitment and a launch of a security advocate fellowship to empower engineers of marginalized backgrounds who historically had their concerns downplayed. The company rolled out the new rapid security escalation workflow publicly as a case study in responsible engineering, framed as how Axiom Labs turned a near threat into a strength. The blog post featured quotes from Martin about culture change, but the more meaningful internal version had a sidebar quoting Jalen in his own words about how technical vigilance without structural support is brittle. Maya was invited to help develop training modules on threat recognition for engineering teams. The red team was formally embedded into product planning sprints with protected time and voice. But the legacy of having been ignored didn't evaporate without resistance. Some senior execs, invested in maintaining streamlined communication, grumbled that the new process added friction. A few influential middle managers, who had previously equated sounding alarms with career risk, pushed back with passive language and write-ups. Overly cautious and new fellowship dilutes urgency. Jalen found himself in meetings where his identity as a black coder was caricatured in micro ways. Phrases like passionate concern surfaced as softer critiques compared to how similar technical proposals from others were described as strategic foresight. He raised it in the new Oversight Council, and the council crafted a mandatory bias awareness module for security and product reviewers to parse language differences in risk framing. Externally, the press piece that went live credited the quick defense and included a small profile of the security engineers who spotted the anomaly ahead of time. The cybersecurity community took notice. Peer blog posts praised the depth of transparency and the inclusion of the engineer voices. Jalen began receiving messages, some from other underrepresented engineers sharing their own ignored bug stories, some from recruiters offering lucrative counteroffers. A few months later, a respected industry conference invited him and Maya to co-present on bridging technical expertise and organizational trust in security operations. He accepted, using the platform to talk about the structural barriers that allow almost breaches to persist, and how identity plays into whose voice gets amplified. Martin, watching from the sidelines, initially uncertain how to navigate his public persona, eventually began introducing Jalen in talks not just as a technical lead, but as a security culture co-architect. He advocated internally for the fellowship to have an endowment and to be positioned as a stepping stone for leadership. In private, he asked Jalen for feedback on the company's diversity efforts and technical risk channels. Jalen pressed for measurable metrics beyond representation, like who's heard in security reviews and whose risk framing gets privileged. A year after the near hack, Axiom Labs rolled out a security equity dashboard that tracked not only vulnerabilities, but how quickly they were surfaced, escalated, and resolved, disaggregated by reporting channel, and including anonymized demographic context to monitor for patterns of whose reports took longer to be addressed. The Security Advocate Fellowship had its first cohort, engineers from varied backgrounds embedded in core product teams with guaranteed time, mentorship from senior risk officers, and a veto-style voice on critical release decisions. The Red Team expanded its remit to include pre-mortem cultural reviews of how communication structures might unintentionally dampen certain reports. Jalen, now partly a mentor in the fellowship, worked with younger fellows to teach them the dual language of technical precision and organizational storytelling, how to frame a report so it couldn't be easily dismissed without losing the integrity of the finding. Maya and he co-authored an internal white paper on defense depth and psychological safety, which was shared beyond the company with permission, influencing a few of their major clients to adopt similar escalation protocols. Martin, having evolved his public narrative, began speaking about the day our arrogance almost cost us everything, highlighting the need to build systems that invited challenge rather than brushed it aside. The Security Review Board became a permanent fixture in the product roadmap process, rather than an ad hoc meeting. The company's retention of diverse security talent improved because a culture had been seeded where flagging problems didn't carry an extra emotional tax for those already marginalized. Occasionally, when new hires asked why the Advocate Fellowship existed, Jalen would smile and tell the story, not as victimhood, but as a lesson in leverage. How one overlooked patch, if ignored, could have burned trust, revenue, and perhaps the company's future, and how the combination of technical persistence and structural allyship changed the trajectory. The multi-million-dollar hack that almost was never written as a what if became a textbook example inside Axiom Labs and rippled outward in industry talks about building resilient cultures, not just resilient code. In the quiet after hours, Jalen still kept the original bug report in a private document, annotated with the evolution of the patch. the timeline of dismissals, the moment the attack was defused, and the systemic changes that followed. It wasn't a grievance. It was a map. He added a short note at the bottom, before sending the next cohort of fellows into their first risk review. Your voice is the first line of defense. Guard it, frame it. Don't let them silence what could save us all.